Hi there. I sure wish I could be with you in person, but until that time, this video will have to do. Today, I want to talk to you about the importance of having a kind of experimental approach to fulfilling the purposes that God has for us. Um, One of my favorite quotes is by David Smith, and he says this. He says, "Every day the church must wake up and ask itself, what kind of day is today? For no 2 days are alike in our history." Some of you are familiar with the sigmoid curves of growth, that every living thing starts off slow, has a rapid period of growth, and then eventually declines. And Smith introduces to the church a term he calls liminality. And liminality is that place where what used to work no longer works, but what will work has not yet been fully discovered. And so I would say that in the old days, a couple of years ago, we sort of knew what to do. But when COVID hit and different things have happened, that what was effective back then is kind of running out, and we're yet to discover, in the process of discovering what's going to work in the future to fulfill God's mission. And I think the great thing, so the liminal space is defined as that time when the Israelites were taken into captivity. They're sitting down by the rivers of Babylon, trying to figure out how to connect with God in a foreign land, because everything they'd done up until this time had been based on a calendar and a temple. But now they didn't have those. And how could they connect with God in a foreign land? It's a place where young men in tribal societies are wrested from their mothers and circumcised, taken across the river, and live with the men for 30 days. They're not quite men, but they're no longer boys. It's this in-between place. And the great thing about being in a liminal space is that we're not victims to the future, but we get to help create that future. And that's what this session is really about. For the last 40 years, I've worked in a beautiful city in Colorado called Boulder. And Boulder is a fantastic place. Just as pictured, just displays a little bit of the beauty of Boulder, but it's a fantastic place. It's also a magnet for people to come to from all over the world. And so it's interesting that Boulder, for this little town, has been named pound for pound the most innovative city in America. More businesses start per capita than any place in the world. So you have, for instance, between the years 2009, 2014, 6,600 businesses were started. At the same time, 52 church planters left. And that brings us to a question, well, are these entrepreneurs really smarter than church planters? Or were they working from a different system? And so I want to introduce Eric Ries. Most of you know him because you've already bought the book, but he wrote 2 books. And one of the things he does, he gave us a great definition of what a startup was, because I think it actually applies not just to church planting, which is really a startup for a faith community, but for any ministry that you're doing in your church. So he describes a startup as a human institution designed to deliver a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And that's us, isn't it? We really don't know what to do, so the best we can come up with is create some hypothesis. And that brings us to the second quote I like by him, but he says this, he says, "There's no knowledge in the room. There's only hypotheses that need to be tested in the streets." And I think that should be our motto, rather than getting a word from the Lord and then thinking we got it down, is that we can come up with a hypothesis in the room, but let's go test that in the streets. I think about, his process really begins with that hypothesis here, and then he builds something, he runs an experiment. And it's going to be around what he calls a minimum viable product or service, just small enough to see if your idea is on the right track. And then that takes us to, once you do that experiment, then you get some type of result, which is measure. And then you do a little analysis of what that means. And then what did you learn from that experiment? If it succeeded, you persevere. You say, man, eureka, we found it. Let's move ahead. But if it doesn't mean it's a failure, because then you just pivot. And Reese says a pivot isn't a change in the vision or change in your mission, but it's a change in the tactic or strategy to fulfill that vision. And this is the most wonderful gift that he gives us, because we don't have to be right the first time. And then what happens is we do the whole process over again. We rinse and repeat, until we find the sustainable business model. And I use that until we find out what works. I think of the lean startup approach it has to do with A/B experiments. In other words, here's the goal we want to accomplish, and just a sec here. Here's the goal we want to accomplish. And here, this approach, A approach, and a B approach to getting us there. But as much as we respect what Eric Ries developed, he didn't invent A/B testing. I think that goes all the way back to Daniel. Do you remember the story where he said, test your servants for 10 days. Just give us vegetables, and at the end of the time, compare us to those who eat all the royal foods. That's the build stage. And that's what they did. They agreed. They tested them for 10 days. At the end of the time, they looked healthier than those that were given the king's best food. That was their measurement. Then, so the guard took away the choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them just vegetables instead. And that was what they learned. And so they decided not to pivot, but to persevere in that approach. So you go back to, again, what Reese said, but the lean startup approach is based on small batch experiments. It's based on validated learning. And validated learning means there's no such thing as failure, because it's either success or what did we learn? What did we learn? And we just kind of keep going, keep pushing towards that vision, that mission that God's given us. Eric Ries might have been written it down for the first time in modern time, but he didn't invent the build, measure, learn cycle either. I think we have to go back to another guy that wrote 2 books, and that would be King Solomon, the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Proverbs. The book of Ecclesiastes might be subtitled A Lean Startup Approach to Wise Living, because he follows the exact same process that Eric Ries used. In other words, he had a problem that he wanted to solve. By the way, you've got to have, for this process to work, there has to be a question you'd answered, or a problem that you want solved, and it begins with there. But his hypothesis was, or his problem was, I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during their few days of their lives. And so he had his process. He started with that hypothesis. Then he built some experiments and created a product or service. I took under great projects. I built houses and planted vineyards and reservoirs and slaves and flocks and treasures and singers and harems. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I didn't refuse myself any pleasure. And what happened when he measured it, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything I had achieved, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And so basically what he learned there was nothing was gained under the sun. And the whole book of Ecclesiastes is simply going through his hypothesis of what might satisfy and what was the good thing that people were supposed to do during their time on earth. And so instead of persevering because he didn't find the answer, he pivoted and did the whole thing over and over again. So then it was other things. It was diligence and investments and youth and old age and relationships. And every time when he didn't find the answer, he'd pivot and do something new. In that sense, until he finally found the answer. He says, here's the conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. So he found the, quote, sustainable business model for successful living. And so the question is that if Solomon, who is the wisest of the wise, couldn't intuitively understand what the answer was, what the solution was, but he had to go through this build, measure, learn process, can we really hope to do any better? Couldn't we just, maybe the wisdom that was all about Solomon was ability to experiment over and over and over again, build, measure, learn, until he found the right answer. And that's what I think it is. Let me introduce you to a friend of mine, Bill Hippenmeyer. Bill and I work for the same company here in Boulder. And Bill was the senior director for Google for Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. And Bill said at Google, he said we had 2 types of problems. The first type of problem was what he called a complicated problem. A complicated problem is really hard, but there is a known solution, so you just need to execute against that solution. You can't pretend nobody knows the answer because it's been figured out. So he said if we had all the pieces of the car on the floor in front of us, it would be really hard. That's a very complicated problem. But if we had the tools and we had a manual, instruction manual, we could do it. We might not like it, but we could do it. Complex problems they're different because there is no known solution. And so the best thing we can do is come up with a hypothesis of what might solve that problem. And so we create a hypothesis. We believe that if we do this, it'll lead to more of, if we want to increase something, or less of this. To test our hypothesis, we'll create a following experiment. And that's how those complex problems eventually get solved, just through experimentation. So in former times with complicated problems, people kind of knew the answers. And we'd write books about those answers, purpose-driven church, sticky church, revived church, church growth. Even I'll throw a book that I co-wrote with my friend Rick Ries on externally focused church. And the idea was we figured it out, and if you do it, you can figure it out too. But that's not today. That doesn't work in times of complex problems. And so again, because we're in time in this liminality. And so what are the problems that every church has to solve for that are now complex during this time of liminality? And I think it really goes down to, oh, by the way, so I want to introduce now what we call the church engagement framework, which is really the operating system for every church. You know what an operating system is? You have the hardware of your computer. Then you have the operating system, whether you use a Mac or whether you use Microsoft. But every computer, whatever operating system they have the same one, but then the application of the programs they put on are different. Those are the ones that interface with the end user. So the operating system, these are the 5 things that every church from Pentecost on has had to solve for. Churches that go out of business, churches that close their doors have failed to solve for one of these 5 things. These things are, they have to figure out how to attract people, how to make people aware that your church exists. Second thing they need to do is get people in the door for the first time to an event or a service. The third thing they need to do is figure out how to keep people coming back, closing that back door. Then they have to figure out how to grow people. Every church has an ad hoc growth model that's something like this. If we believe that people do this, this, and this, or this and this, they become a disciple. And the last thing they need to solve for is how to create disciples who are actually multiplying the mission of the church. They move from being a consumer of the mission to actually they're multiplying the church through their giving, through their leading, through their inviting, through their evangelizing, their discipling, through their mentoring, and they're advocating, always advocating for the church. And what happens is that the system is so universal that every job that all your pastors of your church have to solve for the same things. Youth ministers have to solve for these things. The online people have to solve for these things. And so when we think about it, that attract and get are about people that you don't have. Keep, grow, and multiply are people that you do have. These are about consumption. Verse 4 about consumption. The last one is about contribution. That's what we want to do. Because every consumptive activity begins with a law of diminishing returns attached to it. In other words, if you've ever been to an all-inclusive resort, man, this is the greatest thing ever, but by night 5, let's go get some street tacos. One thing too, Christian Schwartz gave us a great illustration about the staves of a barrel, and I want to apply it to this, but he said like the staves of the barrel is not what you do best of attract, keep, grow, multiply that determine your future, but what you do worse. In other words, if you have no one under 35, you have no future. You have no young families. You can't get and keep those people. So a simple way we do this with the experimentation is we start with, I call it start with why, and your y axis, and this just comes from the statistics, is always the problem or goal, problem you're trying to solve or the goal you're trying to achieve. Then your hypothesis, your x-axis, are your hypothesis to reach those goals. So when running experiments, you actually have a real problem that you're trying to solve, which is your why, increasing first-time guests, getting people to return, all the way down here. And then what you do is you create a hypothesis of what you think is going to move that needle. So for your first experiment, you can just start right now. And so the first thing you can do is asking yourself, what problem are you solving for? Is around track, get, keep, growing, multiply, and then writing out a concise statement of the problem you're solving. And then what would an epic win look like? If you were totally successful and your dreams came true, what would that look like? Then your hypothesis, we believe that if we do this, the result will be this, your desired outcome. And then what will you do, your experiment, who will lead it, how will you measure it, what success looks like. When you run that experiment, maybe it might take a couple weeks, maybe it might take a month or two. I have a church in San Francisco that I work with, and they have people assigned each of these things, and they do 2 experiments in each area every 4 months. And that would be it. Then afterwards, you measure it by these things. We believed that we did this. We thought the result would be this. Here's what we did, how we measured it, and what the results were. So that's about it. It's just been a delight to be with you guys. And I just hope you take this step and put it into practice. And then you got my contact information if you want to interact with me. I'm also leaving a few resources for you guys to follow up with. Bye-bye. Winchell's, 1453, I did it.